I think an expert is sometimes the person that you invite in from someplace else. I just want to, you guys have Leslie Sturmer here. She's a great resource. I'm glad that FX wanted us, Rusty Grice and I, to come over. We're glad to help out. We're glad to be an additional resource, but you have an excellent resource in state. So you should take advantage of the amazing work that she's done and continues to do. I'm just wanted to show you, I know the site here has been selected, but sometimes when we start talking about what farm gear you're going to use, people start talking to me about they like this gear or that gear. Let the site determine the gear. Please let the site determine the gear. Do not buy gear that does not work at the site. So find that site, see what that site looks like. See what it looks like in terms of some of the biological, physical, economic, the social limitations out there, and then choose your gear. There are gear suppliers that will sell you gear from anywhere, all right? And they all have good reasons to buy their gear. And I'm not saying they're being dishonest. They all have good reasons. But you need to decide first if it fits the site that you're at. So remember, you're raising a filter feeding bivalve, all right? That animal needs phytoplankton to grow, so you need good food quality, and you need to find out if there's good oyster growth and survival at the site. Now, Leslie, did you have some of that data? Does that show how this site, the site that's proposed here, how it compares to other sites?
It does, but you gotta remember that's
Dated, okay. All right. That is just something you're going to want to take a look at and figure out. There are other growers. You have growers in Wakulla. You have growers in Alligator Harbor. You want to find out how your growth rates compare. It's not a competition. It'll just help you with your business planning to know if you're getting to market a couple months sooner or a couple months later. That is important in your business planning. You want to know what your predators are. The big advantage of your gear is that you're getting your oysters up off the bottom away from those predators. All right? That's great. If you don't take care of that gear, all those predators will find your gear and your oysters, and they'll live in there, and they'll be happy to eat all your oysters before they go to market. So it does protect them, but you then have to maintain that. Leslie mentioned the fouling community. You're going to have to find out, we worked with some of the growers. I worked with Canaan on a project, and we saw like a lot of barnacles on the bags up at your site, and then worked with another farm in Alligator Harbor, and there were those squirts all over the stuff. You're going to have to find out what's going to grow all over your bags, and you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do to control it. Disease. I know there's a lot of data on disease. Dermo is the big one. Everyone familiar with dermo? All right. The good news with farmed oysters so far has been that our growth rates in farmed oysters up off the bottom, we're able to get them to market from the day they're spawned to the day they go to market in about 12 months, and we've been able to beat disease. So even if they're in an area with dermo, they get to market before they die from dermo. I don't know if you guys have seen that, any problems anywhere else in Florida with dermo killing off-bottom oysters, but we typically have not seen that in Alabama or Mississippi. All right, and obviously you do want a good sense of what your salinity range there is, and Leslie went over this, so I won't beat this to death. You want to have a sense of the temperature, the dissolved oxygen, the water depth, your current. The more flow, the better generally. So that's one reason you don't want your stuff to be crowded up, and you don't want your bags all fouled up. What is the bottom type like out at the site? Can you walk it? Sandy? All right. So that makes it easier. What's the typical depth out at the site? 3 to 6 feet. Yeah, that's great. Obviously, you need to have your required permits. You have to know your terms of your lease and that water quality classification and some of those issues that Kim mentioned. In the logistics, you need to be thinking about the time temperature requirements for you to get from that farm to where you're landing them, all right, and how you're going to keep them cold and meet the public health requirements. How long is your trip to the farm, and what's your security? I think Leslie makes a great point that one of the advantages of these clustered either oyster farming parks or use zones is that you have each other to watch each other's farms. That is actually, even if you're not on your farm every day, hopefully somebody is at the site. And I did want to just mention, obviously, it's great that you're looking at farming and thinking about that, but you are farming in a public sector, so you do need to think about conflicts with other stakeholders, and there's just no way around that. You are there, but it's a privilege to be there, and so you do need to think about being a good neighbor. I've worked in a couple places where I've had farmers fairly aggressively tell people to go away, and that often doesn't work out well. I found that it works out better just to explain what you're doing, almost like you're a little bit of a tour guide. Like, glad you're interested, here's what we're doing. I got to get back to work. Obviously, marine debris, and there are some best management practices out there. I know Florida, you guys, they are required, But you would not be opposed to adopting additional like best management practices from East Coast shellfish growers if,
They're welcome to look at
okay,
the
okay. Pretty much the same?
process.
Okay. All right. So the culture gear options are typically, traditionally we've done it on the bottom with no gear, but now if you're thinking about getting up off the bottom, it's what I would call suspended gear or floating gear are your two options. And suspended, just imagine a clothesline and you're deciding what level that clothesline is at. Floating gear is, it's floating up at the top. But then you're going to need to think about what's my boat, what does my work barge look like, what am I doing to raise my baby oysters, what kind of truck and a trailer do I have, a sorter and a grader, and so on. So again, there are lots of gear distributors that will have all this in their catalog that you can buy. Like you can spend a lot of money being an oyster farmer. The biggest thing though for your farm, I would argue, is you need a cost-effective plan to control biofouling. We have seen lots of people get into oyster farming in the Gulf of Mexico because of the temptation of you see $3 oysters on menus, and that looks like you should be able to get rich on it. That's not what you'll make as a farmer. Like typically it's more like 50 cents an oyster or something like that is what your farmer gets. But it is incredibly labor intensive and gear intensive. You can't grow these without the gear and without the people, without the hands on it, because your oyster wants to grow fast. So does everything else in the ocean. It all wants to grow on your stuff. And so how are you going to control that? And we had people that tried power washing, people that have tried brine dips and all that. We recommend at Auburn, we recommend routine air drying. Like that is the most cost-effective way to do it. But I'm just telling you, I've talked to folks in other counties in Florida. I have very few farmers that think that it's worthwhile to go out once a week to flip their stuff out of the water and then go back the next day and flip it back. Nope, too much work, I'm not going to do it. I just have a bunch of farmers that have abandoned that as a strategy. I would argue I see that often in the product. Like I can open up boxes of oysters and tell you how well they were taken care of. Like,
So if they don't do that, what do they do?
if they don't do it, some things you can do are you can have a lot of wave action. Some people have lowered their densities in their surface bags. They have so much wave action that the oysters are bouncing around so much that they don't get fouled because nothing can do that. I've seen people, like what else, what are some of the options, Kanan, what do you see some of the other?
A lot of people will just tumble the oysters.
Tumble them,
And then I'd say the least cost-effective method is a lot of people
scrape them.
hire a bunch of high schoolers and they
Uh,
beat
I-
the crap out of it.
I had a small farm in Cape Cod Bay with my wife, a weekend farm, and I'll tell you what, like I would get a barnacle set and I would sit there scraping barnacles off of each oyster to try to get them, and I was like, not making money every time I was scraping barnacles. So it is a case of be ahead of the problem. If you wait to see that fouling and say, now I'm going to control it, you've made too much work for yourself. Like it's a mistake. You need to proactively be ahead of it. So looking at the suspended gear, one reason we like this type of gear is this is an Australian long line system. These baskets go on lines, and you can, like, once a week, every 10 days, you can go lift the bag out of the water, and then the next day lower those lines back in. So for most of the week, they're in the water drinking, and one day out, the oysters survive that, but the fouling doesn't. You then have to make sure before you harvest that they're submerged for 14 days before they go to market, all right? There's another trick we've seen farmers try to find that perfect intertidal zone where they set that basket just at that magic spot where they're getting just enough water to grow, but they're not getting any fouling. And my only reservation about that is I've seen that recommended in a lot of places, and if you're one of those farmers that thinks you're going to go out and just check that, like every other month or so you're going to go check that, that's going to get messed up. You have to be one of the farmers that you are on that farm pretty much every week, every day is what I'd like, because you'll see if there's a problem and you can fix it. I've just seen a lot of people put a lot of oysters in bags and then make a mess. It'll turn into a gnarly mess. So this is a good, by the way, this is not going to work for us. This is on the West Coast. Obviously, this is an intertidal zone that we don't have, but I'm just showing you. They've actually got oysters strung on lines across that. I don't know if we could do that in Florida. We could not, even if we were 3 feet off the bottom? Really? All right. Well, then moving on. All right. I want to try it. So the pros, easy handling, inventory control. Tumbling, the idea is those baskets on those lines are rocking your babies all the time, and it's tumbling those oysters. You're getting good fouling control. You've got this automated grading and loading equipment if you want to buy it. and it's got a great tropical storm strategy. We take all those baskets, we drop them down to the lowest clip, and we walk away. And we hope that the storm surge goes up and over, and that our stuff stays clear of the debris. Now this would work for this site, but it is a pretty limited tidal range that works well, and you do need firm bottom, so this sounds like a site that this would work for. It's pretty visually obvious, so you have to decide how people feel about that. And then it's labor-intensive gear installation. There's no way around that. To go to the question about grants, an acre of that gear is probably going to cost you $50,000. You're going to spend a lot of money. Now you're going to raise probably $200,000, $250,000 ballpark, $250,000 an acre a year with that gear. For a business person that can come up with that kind of money, that looks like good math. For me, I don't have that kind of cash, so I don't know how I get there. But if you can get a business loan or an agricultural loan, there's a way to show somebody that math works out. I think Andrew will show a little more depressing math on that, but that's ballpark. So the other option here is floating, and I've clumped the floating cages and the floating bags, all right? And I think there's a bigger difference here between floating. I think Charlie said that the cages are bigger. That's one thing, but there are some other differences here. So if you look at these cages, these pontoons, you can flip this cage out of the water. So remember those baskets that I told you that we drop below the water or out of the water? So this cage, when I want to dry them, it's heavy, but I can do it by myself. I'll show you how to do it sometime. But you can flip that cage out of the water, and the oysters will ride on the pontoons high and dry. All right? So the cage is out of the water, and the oysters are out of the water with this system. With this bag, when I flip that bag over, the oysters stay in the water the whole time. So the fouling control on this floating bag system doesn't let the oyster dry out. Now, there are tricks to that. You can stack bags on top of each other, but the typical floating bag system, you flip the bag, and the oysters are never getting the air dry that I want them to get. All right? The other concern that I have is this system, my storm plan is I flip the cage over, I pull the caps, and I walk it down to the bottom. It's on a long line, and I want it in a chain on the bottom, sunk on the bottom. The floating bags are harder to do, and I don't know if Kanan, if you have recommendations for floating bags. I've heard people pull the floats. There's a lot of different strategies, but very few people have floats that you can sink on the floating bags. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. Most people are just pulling the floats off.
Okay.
Together and letting them sink to the bottom.
Right.
But the 4.5 square inch floats, they have caps?
Yeah, you can get them here. I've seen very few people invest in those. Yeah. So some of the pros, you get that easy inventory control. You can adapt to a variety of water depths. So if you're looking at a deeper site, this is a good system. You can get really nice tumbling with this, especially in rough water. You do get that fouling control with that flipping. You can move that gear around, and you have a tropical storm strategy that is maybe less perceived as having less success than the Australian longline systems. Some of the cons are those cages get pretty heavy. You might require additional labor, or you're getting in the water to flip them. It's relatively space inefficient due to the flotation, and you really need to be sure of your anchors and reduce your chafe. So it's too late to go through a bunch of graphs, so I just want to show you we have compared the gear types to see how they do. There are differences. Don't take these numbers. This is percent survival. This was a cage on the bottom. I just want to show you, we were at 70 to somewhere like 85% ballpark. If you're not getting 70% of what you planted to market, I'd be concerned. I'd say I'm doing something wrong. I'd like you to do better than that, but realistically, I think 75% is where I'd like you to be minimum. If you can be in the 80s, that's great. But we do see differences in terms of shell height. I just want to show you that OG is the oyster grow cage, that floating cage. The oysters were a little smaller. So you might say, well, I don't want that gear if they're not going to grow as fast. But one of the things that we did find was is that it also made a deeper cupped oyster. It made what buyers were perceiving as a prettier oyster too. The other gear does produce those as well. But we know you can affect the shape with the gear. Some other things you want to consider are obviously how much it costs. And what your replacement costs are. We're working on that. Everyone who sells the gear always says it'll last for like 8 years, 10 years. You know, the ease of use. So my wife is 5'1". So working with a big oyster grow cage for her was not an option. Even the Vexar bags that are 3 feet by 1.5 feet, that is too much weight away from her body. If I hand her that bag, that is too rough on her back. I could hand her one of those SEPA baskets though, and that was a good unit for her to work with, all right? Durability of the gear, your ability to replace and restock gear, and then customer support. Again, I think Leslie mentioned there are a lot of local suppliers now for some of this gear. So what does the gear look like from above? Like here you've got one of the farms, so you get rows of these here. We typically are doing them in runs of about 300 feet, about 100 yards. I don't know if that would fit. What would you all do here? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So you can see this is what we're starting to look at. We've got lines of floating cages, but you can see. So one thing I wanted you to see, and I know it's a little hard with the light in here, but obviously the long line system gives you very efficient space use, right? I mean, it's like Legos, right? You know, you can make your rows and you know where you're going. If you're using floating cages, you do have to think about having that they're going to luff back and forth, and you got to think about how you're going to get in there and work that. So if you are concerned about how many you can grow per acre, and you only have a limited number of acres, typically people have been leaning more towards an Australian longline system, is what we've seen. Is that fair to say? Wave action exposure, water flow, and getting in and out. Please don't skimp on infrastructure. I know this is expensive, right? But consider professional help. What you put into putting your farm in is what will keep your farm there through the first storm and the last storm that your farm survives. So you got to think about jetting or vibrating in pilings if that, are pilings allowed? Okay. And whether you have a diver available, that sometimes help. Neatness counts. You all have driven by like a farm that doesn't look good versus a farm that looks good. That makes a big difference with how people are going to perceive your farm. To keep it short, I wanted to jump to common mistakes. If you take this class, you'll hear this again and again. Buying too much seed for too little gear and too few hands is the #1 mistake, because everyone's thinking that they're buying 50-cent pieces. And so I'll buy more let me buy all these seed because they'll all turn into 50-cent pieces. And I have seen people buy 1 million oysters and only get, let's say, 500,000 or less to market. And their solution to that problem was I needed to buy 1.5 million oysters. And they get even less to market, because all those oysters are going to do is grow in the bag, and you will fall further and further behind, because the blessing of these oysters is that they will grow incredibly fast for you in those bags. The curse of these oysters is they will grow incredibly fast for you in these bags. Those bags will get stuffed, and then you'll start to see the bags will break. The oysters will start to have winners and losers. You'll have big ones and small ones, ugly ones. You'll have ones that can't go to market. You'll eventually get mortality in those bags, and when a storm comes through, your gear is going to fail. All right? It is, I promise, you are much better off with keeping it with lower stocking densities. And I know that sounds expensive because the gear is expensive, but you don't make money growing oysters, Skid Row says, of East Coast shellfish growers. You make money selling oysters, all right? So you need to sell oysters, right? So you need to get them to market. The other thing is waiting for a problem to appear before doing something. Oyster farming is not about waiting to react. You have to be proactive. You have to have a plan. You have to know that biofouling is going to happen and how you're going to control it. Grow what your customer wants, not what you think they want. This is the other thing I've seen is along the Gulf Coast, we have a really great tradition of oysters. And so you get a bunch of people that all know what the perfect oyster is. And it turns out that the young woman in Atlanta doesn't know anything about that. She doesn't care about the 4-inch oyster that looks like a steak in your hand. She wants a can you sell under 3 inches? Okay, good. She wants a 2 3/4-inch deep cupped oyster. And it turns out that's your market. I'm not saying that it is, right? I'm not saying that it is, but don't make the mistake of growing what you think is the perfect oyster. Find out what your market wants and grow that. Because we had a bunch of guys that spent a lot of time growing 4-inch oysters, and they realized, what am I doing? I could have sold all those back when they were 2 3/4 inches, as long as they were pretty. All right. That is it. Oh, the only other thing I would say for seed supply, my only point about October is too late to find seed. That's not a seed shortage. That is trying to get seed after the seed production has happened. So everybody knows typically most of our hatcheries are spawning maybe now, maybe next month, right? And then they're going to start spawning maybe through September. And you need to have your orders in before those spawns happen. You are only catching what's left if you get stuff in October. Yes, sir.
105,000 oysters. How many SEPA baskets do you use?
So I always work backwards from the final grow out density that I would recommend. And for SEPA, like SEPA or a BST or Hexel, they're all sort of competitors. And I'm not recommending any particular brand. Typically, I would say those are probably 75 to 100 oysters at most per basket at final grow out density. So that's your worst case scenario. Take 105,000 and divide it by 75 or 100. Of course, you wouldn't have you are growing a bell curve of oysters. So you buy a batch of seed in May, and then you buy a batch of seed in August. And you're gonna work that bell curve. That one from May, you're gonna try to be harvesting, let's say, in February, March, and April, May of the next year, right? And so not everything is going to be coming to market size at the same time. But I want you to be thinking about, well, what if it were all at market size? Would I have a home for it? Because typically I've got people buying a bunch of baby oysters, and we all kick the can down the road. I'll buy those baskets later, and typically they don't have enough baskets on hand to spread out.